Hey, we are in Job chapter 8 this evening, but this is the outline of the book that we've been following. We're in the section dealing with this debate between Job and his three friends. There's this long section in the book from chapter 3 through to chapter 27. We began there looking at Job's lament in chapter 3, where he starts all of this off by expressing his wish that he'd never been born, his wish that he had died at birth. And then we've gone in now to this first round of speeches, which goes from chapter 4 through to chapter 14. And there are three rounds of these speeches, which will take us through to chapter 27. So here in the first round of speeches, we've looked at Eliphaz's first speech in chapters 4 and 5, and then Job's response to that, which we looked at last week in chapters 6 and 7. And then this evening we'll be looking at Bildad's first speech in chapter 8, and then Job's reply to that speech in chapters 9 and 10. So there's a few chapters for us to get through here this evening. So we're going to begin here in chapter 8, which is Bildad's first speech. And Job's Bildad is the second friend who's mentioned. He's described as being Bildad the Shuhite. And now he is responding to what Job has just said in the previous chapters. So we'll read here, we'll read through the whole chapter 8. It's not too long, but we'll read the whole of his speech here. Bildad the Shuhite said in reply, "How long will you speak such things? Your utterances are a mighty wind. Will God pervert the right? Will the Almighty pervert justice? If your sons sinned against him, he dispatched them for their transgression. But if you seek God and supplicate the Almighty, if you are blameless and upright, he will protect you and grant well-being to your righteous home. Though your beginning be small, in the end you will grow very great. Ask the generation past, study what their fathers have searched out. For we are of yesterday and know nothing. Our days on earth are a shadow. Surely they will teach you and tell you, speaking out of their understanding. Can papyrus thrive without marsh? Can rushes grow without water? While still tender, not yet plucked, they would wither before any other grass. Such is the fate of all who forget God. The hope of the impious man comes to naught, whose confidence is a thread of gossamer, whose trust is a spider's web. He leans on his house, it will not stand. He seizes hold of it, but it will not hold. He stays fresh even in the sun. His shoots spring up in his garden. His roots are twined around a heap. They take hold of a house of stones. When he is uprooted from his place, it denies him, saying, I never saw you. Such is his happy lot. And from the earth others will grow. Surely God does not despise the blameless. He gives no support to evildoers. He will yet fill your mouth with laughter and your lips with shouts of joy. Your enemies will be clothed in disgrace. The tent of the wicked will vanish. So here's Bildad's response to what Job has said in the previous chapters. And he begins here by showing his annoyance with Job for the way in which Job has spoken. In verse 2, he asks, how long will you speak such things? Your utterances are a mighty wind. Job's words, which have been spoken so strongly, as far as Bildad is concerned, are meaningless. They're like a mighty wind. You might describe him as Job being like an old windbag, that his words are meaningless. And Bildad then defends the justice of God by asking, will God pervert the right? Will the Almighty pervert justice? Later, when we come to the fourth character, Elihu, in one of his speeches in chapter 34 and verse 12, he expresses that same thought as well concerning the justice of God. In chapter 34, verse 12, Elihu says, for God surely does not act wickedly. Shaddai, that's the Almighty, does not pervert justice. Abraham also said something similar in Genesis chapter 18 and verse 25, when God had told Abraham that he was going to destroy the city of Sodom, and Abraham is pleading with God on behalf of the righteous who might still be in the city. And in verse 25 of Genesis 18, he says to God, "Far be it from you to do such a thing, to bring death upon the innocent as well as the guilty, so that innocent and guilty fare alike. Far be it from you, shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly?" So Abraham also had that view that God Almighty does not act unjustly. This is what Bildad is telling Job here, that God is just. But even though at this point Job hasn't actually expressed that, although that will come shortly. But in Bildad's reasoning, if Job maintains his innocence, then that must mean that God is unjust, because a just God would not inflict suffering upon the innocent. So if Job really is innocent, then God must be unjust if these sufferings are coming upon Job. That's his argument here. Bildad then raises the matter of Job's children in verse 4. He says, "If your sons sinned against him, he dispatched them for their transgression." What he's suggesting here is that Job's children died for their own sins, that it was their own fault. They were paying the price for their own sins. And this must have been a particularly hurtful comment, because Job had always made offerings for his children's hidden sins, as we saw back in chapter 1 and verse 5, and he was always concerned about his children's spiritual well-being. And so for Bildad to suggest that, well, they died for their own sins, that must have hurt Job. But we, the readers, know that Bildad's assessment here is not true, because we have been privy to the discussion between the adversary and the Lord. And we know that the death of Job's children was part of this challenge that the adversary was making, and the Lord allowed that to happen. So their deaths had nothing to do with their own personal sins. However, Bildad goes on to suggest that if Job were to seek God and to petition the Almighty, if he really is blameless and upright, as he claims, then God will protect him. God will bless his home. He will become prosperous. His beginning may be small, but in the end he will become great. And this is a view that is still held and still promoted by some people today, that righteous people will be rewarded with earthly prosperity. It's known as the prosperity gospel. So live a righteous life, and God is going to give you a nice car and a nice house and make you very rich. Bildad then tells Job to consider the wisdom of past generations, and they will teach him, because they know better than us, because we've only been around for a short time. Bildad assumes that what was being taught in the past then must be correct. So follow the traditions rather than examine the evidence for yourself. In verses 11 to 13 of chapter 8, the wicked are likened to papyrus plants and rushes, which need a marsh or water in order to grow and thrive. If they have no water, then they will wither. And this is what happens, the withering happens to those who forget God, and their hope comes to nothing. The tenuous confidence or hope of the wicked or the impious is likened here to a thread of gossamer or a spider's web which is easily broken. Or it's like a house which appears to be solid, but when it's leant on, then it collapses. But in contrast are the righteous, who he describes in verses 16 to 19, who are likened to this well-watered, flourishing plant, which stays fresh even in the sun. He says, such is his happy lot, and from the earth others will grow. And Bildad concludes by arguing in verse 20 that God does not despise the blameless, and he gives no support to evildoers. And if Job really is blameless, then God will yet fill your mouth with laughter and your lips with shouts of joy, whilst his enemies will be clothed in disgrace. The tent of the wicked will vanish. So Bildad's view expressed in this speech is quite simple, really. What he's saying is that God is just, and God rewards the good, and he punishes the wicked. And every one of us fits into one or other of those categories. This was something that was taught by past generations who knew better than us, and so we just have to accept it as being true. Well, chapters 9 and 10 now form Job's reply to Bildad's speech here. And in a brief outline form here, we can see that in chapter 9, verses 1 to 4, Job raises the question, well, who could win a dispute with God? He then will talk about the power of God in verses 5 to 12. And then God will not listen even if Job is right. Job then gives some further illustrations of the brevity of life in chapter 9, verses 25 to 26. And again, even if Job is right, God will still find him guilty. At the end of chapter 9 and then into chapter 10, we find that Job is going to confront God, and God, who made Job, is now tormenting him. And then once again, at the end of this section, Job wishes that he had died at birth. So that's an outline of these two chapters. So we begin here with Job's reply to Bildad in chapter 9, verses 1 to 4. We read this. Job said in reply, "Indeed, I know that it is so. Man cannot win a suit against God. If he insisted on a trial with him, he would not answer one charge in 1,000. Wise of heart and mighty in power, whoever challenged him and came out whole." Job begins here by agreeing with Bildad. He said, "Indeed, I know that it is so." Both Eliphaz and Bildad had advised Job to seek God and address him directly because God is just. God will listen. God is fair. God will listen to you. But here, using language taken from the law courts, Job argues, well, it's difficult for a man to present his case before God because God will not listen. God would not answer any charge or any questions against him. So who then could win a dispute with God? Who could prove himself just or righteous before a God who is wise in heart and mighty in strength? So you cannot challenge God, you cannot question him or oppose him and come out whole in the end. He continues then in verses 5 to 12. He goes on to say, speaking of God here, "Him who moves mountains without their knowing it, who overturns them in his anger, who shakes the earth from its place till its pillars quake, who commands the sun not to shine, who seals up the stars, who by himself spread out the heavens and trod on the back of the sea, who made the Bear and Orion, Pleiades, and the chambers of the south wind, who performs great deeds which cannot be fathomed, and wondrous things without number. He passes me by, I do not see him. He goes by me, but I do not perceive him. He snatches away. Who can stop him? Who can say to him, what are you doing?" So in answer to the question at the end of verse 4, Job asked whoever challenged him and came out whole. Job now describes God's power, how God's power is demonstrated in his control over the creation and how God can weaponize the earth and the heavens against those who oppose him. And Job concludes in verse 10 that God performs great deeds which cannot be fathomed and wondrous things without number. He's just listed there about God moving the mountains, overturning them, shaking the earth, commanding the sun not to shine, sealing up the stars. He's doing all of these things. And verse 10, that this is God who performs these great deeds which cannot be fathomed, and wondrous things without number. So God's actions then are beyond Job's ability to understand. Eliphaz used a similar description of God earlier to encourage Job to lay his case before God, but now Job uses the same words to argue that this is why you cannot get a hearing from God. So back in chapter 5 and verse 9, in Eliphaz's speech there, when he just said, he said, well, I would resort to God. I would lay my case before God. He's encouraging Job to do the same. And that verse 9 describes God here, who performs great deeds which cannot be fathomed, wondrous things without number. So Eliphaz is saying, God is a wonderful God. You can go to him and present your case before him. But here Job uses those same words in chapter 9, verse 10 of God, who performs great deeds which cannot be fathomed and wondrous things without number. And Job is using them in the sense that, well, God is too great, that you can't do that, because you can't make your case because you just don't understand God. God is someone who is too great for Job to perceive. So he passes by, and Job doesn't recognize him, he doesn't see him, and no one can question God. He says in verse 12 there, concluding that part, who can say to him, what are you doing? So God is too great that you can't ask him those sorts of questions. He continues here in verses 13 to 24, saying that God is still not going to listen to him, even if Job is right. In verse 13, he goes on here, God does not restrain his anger. Under him, Rahab's helpers sink down. How then can I answer him or choose my arguments against him? Though I were in the right, I could not speak out, but I would plead for mercy with my judge. If I summoned him and he responded, I do not believe he would lend me his ear. For he crushes me for a hair. He wounds me much for no cause. He does not let me catch my breath, but sates me with bitterness. If a trial of strength, he is the strong one. If a trial in court, who will summon him for me? Though I were innocent, my mouth would condemn me. Though I were blameless, he would prove me crooked. I am blameless. I am distraught. I am sick of life. It is all one. Therefore I say, he destroys the blameless and the guilty. When suddenly a scourge brings death, he mocks as the innocent fail. The earth is handed over to the wicked one. He covers the eyes of its judges. If it is not he, then who? In verse 13 here, Job refers to God's victory over the helpers of Rahab. And Rahab is another of these mythological creatures who we've been meeting in the book, who's associated with evil and chaos. We shouldn't confuse Rahab here with the woman named Rahab who helped the spies in the time of Joshua. The spelling of the two words is different anyway. Rahab here is mentioned again later in Job chapter 26 and verse 12. Job is the speaker here. Speaking of God here, by his power he stilled the sea, by his skill he struck down Rahab. Again, reference to God striking down Rahab there. And then in the Psalms, Psalm 89, verses 10 and 11. Psalm 89, verse 10 and 11 psalmist addressing God again. You rule the swelling of the sea when its waves surge. You still them. You crushed Rahab. He was like a corpse. With your powerful arm, you scattered your enemies. And then in Isaiah chapter 51 and verse 9, awake, awake, clothe yourself with splendor, O arm of the Lord. Awake as in the days of old, as in former ages. It was you that hacked Rahab in pieces, that pierced the dragon. It was you that dried up the sea. Again, these are showing God's control over this creature, Rahab, and God's destruction of Rahab. And here in Job speaks of God's victory over the helpers of Rahab. So if this creature, Rahab, cannot stand before God, then what chance does Job have? And Job maintains that he is blameless, but God is inflicting suffering upon him for no apparent reason, not even allowing Job to catch his breath. If it comes to a trial of strength, then God is going to win because God is the strong one. You don't stand a chance against him, even if you are in the right and blameless, as Job insists that he is. I'm blameless, he says. I am distraught. I'm sick of life. It's all one, he says. And God does not differentiate between the blameless and the guilty, but he destroys them both, treating them alike. And God will even mock the innocent and allow the wicked to take control of the earth, blindfolding the judges and so permitting injustice. And at the end there in verse 24, Job asks, if it is not he, then who? It is not God who does this. Well, then who is it? Tell me, who's going to be doing these things? Job then speaks of the brevity of life in verses 25 and 26. He says, my days fly swifter than a runner. They flee without seeing happiness. They pass like reed boats, like an eagle swooping onto its prey. So he's using these images here of something that passes by quickly, like a runner, someone running, or the reed boat. A reed boat was something that was familiar on the River Nile with the Egyptians, boats made of reed which travelled quickly on the river, or like the swooping eagle swooping down upon its prey. So he's likening the passing of his life to these things. Similarly, back in chapter 7, as we saw last week, verses 6 and 7 there, he used a different picture. My days fly faster than a weaver's shuttle and come to their end without hope. Consider that my life is but wind. I shall never see happiness again. So he's speaking again of how life passes by quickly. Well, he goes on in chapter 9 here, verses 27 to 35, that we see that even if Job is right, then God will still find him guilty. So he says this from verse 27, if I say I will forget my complaint, abandon my sorrow and be diverted, I remain in dread of all my suffering. I know that you will not acquit me. It will be I who am in the wrong. Why then should I waste effort? If I washed with soap, cleansed my hands with lye, you would dip me in muck till my clothes would abhor me. He is not a man like me that I can answer him, that we can go to law together. No arbiter is between us to lay his hand on us both. If he would only take his rod away from me and not let his terror frighten me, then I would speak out without fear of him, for I know myself not to be so. If Job tried to forget his complaint and put away his sorrow and cheered up, then he would be afraid that his sufferings would come back and take hold of him again. And if Job washed himself with soap and lye, God would dip him in muck so that even his clothes would loathe him. It doesn't matter how clean you get, how well you wash, God is still going to treat you as filth. Job realizes that with God, you're not dealing with a fellow human being. You're not dealing with someone who is your equal. So it's not a dispute between two equal parties. And because of this inequality between Job and God, there is no one who can be called upon to act as a mediator to bring about reconciliation between them. And so the situation is hopeless. And all Job wants is for God to take his rod away from me and not let his terror frighten me. Stop doing these things. And then Job would be able to speak freely and honestly about himself and about his innocence. Well, he continues into chapter 10 here, verses 1 to 7. Job is going to confront God now. He says, I am disgusted with life. I will give rein to my complaint, speak in the bitterness of my soul. I say to God, do not condemn me. Let me know what you charge me with. Does it benefit you to defraud, to despise the toil of your hands, while smiling on the counsel of the wicked? Do you have the eyes of flesh? Is your vision that of mere men? Are your days the days of a mortal? Are your years the years of a man? That you seek my iniquity and search out my sin. You know that I'm not guilty, and that there is none to deliver from your hand. So with no mediator to speak on his behalf, then Job is now going to speak openly of his complaint against God. And he's going to speak out of the bitterness of his soul. He declares his loathing of life. I'm disgusted with life, he says, or I loathe my life. Job wants God to make known to him what he's being charged with. Show me what I have done wrong, or stop treating me like this. And what does it benefit God to defraud and despise the work of his hands? That's Job. Job is the work of God's hand. So why is God, what benefit does it bring God for God then to despise him? Whilst at the same time, God is smiling approvingly on the wicked. Job is asking God here, is God a human being? Does he see things from a human perspective? If not, then why should he be bothered by any sin that Job may have committed? What is this doing to God? And God must know that Job is not guilty, but still there is no one who can deliver Job out of God's hands. God holds all of the cards in this. Well, God who created Job then is now tormenting him. Verses 8 to 17 of chapter 10. He says again, he's addressing God directly here, your hands shaped and fashioned me, then destroyed every part of me. Consider that you fashioned me like clay. Will you then turn me back into dust? You poured me out like milk, congealed me like cheese. You clothed me with skin and flesh, and wove me of bones and sinews. You bestowed on me life and care. Your providence watched over my spirit. Yet these things you hid in your heart. I know that you had this in mind, to watch me when I sinned, and not clear me of my iniquity. Should I be guilty, the worse for me. And even when innocent, I cannot lift my head. So sated am I with shame and drenched in my misery. It is something to be proud of, to hunt me like a lion, to show yourself wondrous through me time and again. You keep sending fresh witnesses against me, letting your vexation with me grow. I serve my term and am my own replacement. So God's hand shaped and fashioned Job with great care and then destroyed every part of him. And Job illustrates this with the clay and the dust there, mention of that. He says there in verse 9, consider that you fashioned me like clay. Will you then turn me back into dust? And perhaps he's alluding to the original creation of man in Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. And God created man from the dust of the ground and breathed into him the breath of life. And then with an interesting illustration of the milk and the cheese in verse 10, you poured me out like milk, congealed me like cheese, as if God is the great cheese maker, and he makes a man out of cheese, pouring out the milk, and then the milk turns into cheese, and Job likening that to the creation of human flesh. And Job speaks of how God had clothed his body here with skin and flesh and bones and sinews, that God had put him together in this way. It's similar to the description we have in Psalm 139, verse 13. Psalm 139 from verse 13, psalmist addressing God here says, "It was you who created my conscience. You fashioned me in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am awesomely, wondrously made. Your work is wonderful. I know it very well. My frame was not concealed from you when I was shaped in a hidden place, knit together in the recesses of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed limbs. They were all recorded in your book." So again, that idea of God knitting someone together. So God is pictured here as this craftsman who is carefully constructing something. So God had given Job life. This is what God has done to him, given him life and steadfast love, and God had cared for him. God's providence had watched over him. He speaks of that there in verses 8 to 13. But then Job claims to know that God had some other purposes in mind for him. And God's purpose, he says, was to watch Job when he sinned and not clear him of his iniquity. So it's like, well, you just created me, you cared for me just to watch me when I sinned. If Job is guilty, then it will be all the worse for him, he says. And even if he is innocent, then he says he must still hang his head in shame. So it seems that God is just playing with him. This is how Job is viewing this. God is playing with him, hunting him down like a lion hunts its prey, using Job just to show how great he is. So God is pursuing this prosecution against Job. Job concludes this speech here, verses 18 to 22, with another expression of his wish that he had died at birth. "Why did you let me come out of the womb? Better had I expired before any eye saw me. Had I been as though I never was. Had I been carried from the womb to the grave. My days are few, so desist. Leave me alone. Let me be diverted a while before I depart, never to return, to the land of deepest gloom, a land whose light is darkness, all gloom and disarray, whose light is like darkness." Again, here then Job expresses his wish that God would have just let him die in the womb, that he would go directly from the womb to the tomb. We saw in chapter 3, in his first lengthy speech there, Job expressing that desire. And Job seems to think that he only has a few days left, and so he wants God to leave him alone before he departs to that other land, never to return. Again, we see how Job views death here as a land whose light is darkness, all gloom and disarray, whose light is like darkness. There's sort of a contradiction of terms there when he speaks of light being darkness, whose land is a land whose light is darkness. Well, how can light be darkness? The two are completely opposite. But that's how he describes that condition that he thinks that he's going to. And so that's how his speech concludes here. And we can summarize both of these speeches here, Bildad's speech in chapter 8 and then Job's reply in chapters 9 and 10. And again, this is taken from John Walton's commentary on Job, the New International Version application commentary. And summarizing Bildad's speech, he says, "How dare you suggest that God perverts justice? Your children undoubtedly sinned. Face the facts and come clean, then all will go smoothly for you. Traditional wisdom gives you all the information you need, the retribution principle. The wicked perish, but God does not reject a righteous man." And then a summary of Job's reply. "How could anyone ever establish his righteousness before God? You can't argue with him and expect to win. Challenging him would be disastrous. He is too strong to overpower, and he is beyond being called to account. I have nothing left to live for, so I may as well say it outright. He is not just. Both the blameless and the wicked are destroyed. I wish I had an advocate to speak on my behalf. Nothing makes any sense. I can't win. I wish God would just let me die." So those are the summaries. Here's a few questions for us to think about here. Bildad suggested Job should learn from past generations. To what extent should we rely upon past traditions for instruction? Why does Job want to take God to court if he knows he cannot win? Does Job see the power of God as a help or a hindrance? What would your advice to Job be at this point? Well, next week, we will be looking in chapters 11 to 14, where we have Zophar's first speech. He's the third friend to speak, and then we have Job's reply, and that concludes the first round of these speeches, when each of the friends has had a turn to speak and to address Job. So we shall stop that